Well, as always, it's my privilege to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Chris Kerns, who also happens to be our fearless and apparently tireless leader, aka president of the London chapter OAS. Chris is originally from Colorado, where he attended the University of Colorado and completed a double major in anthropology and history, graduating cum laude. He then went on to do not one, but two master's degrees in Britain, one at the University of Manchester in Neolithic archaeology, and the other at the University of Bristol in landscape archaeology. For his doctoral research, he went to the University of Southampton and focused on the histories of archaeological inquiry in Neolithic in the Orkney Islands. In the UK, he had the privilege, I would think, to participate in several academic projects at Neolithic sites, basically in England and Scotland, including being a supervisor at the riverside excavations at Stonehenge and the Ness of Brogdar, which is in the Orkneys, as I recall. Aside from his PhD research, he has nearly 20 years of experience in commercial CRM archaeology in the USA and Canada. He has published several articles and chapters and edited volumes, and he is currently the editor of the proceedings of the 2021 OAS Symposium hosted by the Ottawa chapter. He's based in London here. He currently works for TMHC Inc., formerly Timmins Martell Heritage Consultants, here in London as the Archaeological Special Projects Lead is his position. And so tonight he's going to talk to us about excavations he directed for the University of Bristol, I believe as an archaeological field school some years ago at an Iron Age cave site. And the title is right there in front of you.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. At the start here, I want to give a warning that there is one slide with an image of human remains in it, which I try to avoid having human remains in my presentations, if at all possible. But the image is from the original 1920s excavation of the cave, and it is used to provide context for how the human remains were discovered and the kind of context they were in. You wish I could use a modern image of that bit of the context, but the cave has changed way too much in the preceding 100-ish years, and those conditions no longer exist within the cave, so I can't do that. Here's just an outline for the talk. We will start off by giving you a brief kind of sense of the landscape there for where Reed's Cavern is in the Mendips. Just kind of place it in that landscape context. Then we'll briefly discuss the Iron Age. I know it's not necessarily the most common thing people learn about here in Canada. So the British Iron Age, we'll cover some of the very basics briefly. Then I'll cover the cave's discovery and the initial excavations that took place there. And I will move on to how I got involved and ended up spending 5 weeks directing an excavation in a cave in the dark on a shoestring budget. And finally, I'll end with some of the conclusions we had after our excavations and open it up for questions. Okay, so Reed's Cavern is in southwest England in an area known as the Mendip Hills. The Mendip Hills are south of Bristol, which is right up here, where I lived much of my time during graduate school and where I met my wife. Cheddar Caves and Cheddar Gorge is right in here. That's what the cheese is named after. They're situated on the southern side of the Mendips Hills. The Somerset levels and Glastonbury are a little bit further south, so we're talking in this area here. There's Glastonbury. Glastonbury being famous for its crazy music festival and its connection with Arthurian legends. Just kind of giving you an idea of what's around there. This is a LiDAR image of Reed's Cavern. You can see it here. There's how you get into it. This gives you kind of an idea of what the landscape looks like. You might spot some archaeology on here as well. You might spot this Iron Age hill fort here, Dolbury, and Burrington Camp over here, 2 Iron Age hill forts. And if you're really keen-eyed, you might spot some barrow mound groups. There's one right in here, and another one right down in here. Just as an idea of what's going on in the area. Zoom in a little bit more on the area of Reed's Cavern. You can see the stream kind of heading into where the cave entrance is. These things up here are swallets. We'll get back to swallets in a little bit. Swallets are essentially sinkholes, but it's really the same process is going on here that formed Reed's Cavern. Just kind of giving you a view there of what it is. Now, I know that LiDAR and maps don't always kind of give you an idea of what the landscape's like. Here we're looking from the north towards Burrington Combe. This gorge here is Burrington Combe. This is the town of Burrington. There's that Burrington Camp hill fort right there. Reed's Cavern is up here. When we did the excavations, we went up this windy dirt road around the back of this hill. Yeah, there's the Burrington Camp on this nice dirt track, down a nice walking path, down, followed the stream until we got to the cave entrance area. And this is what the cave entrance looks like today from the outside and then from the inside. And this is what you get when you get inside. So that's kind of the basics of the cave. Now, on to what exactly is a swallet and how the cave was formed. The distinct banding appearance apparent in Mendip geology is derived from the Verisan orogeny, mountain building event at the end of the Carboniferous and the beginning of the Permian. This event put the rocks of the Mendips under great pressure, causing them to fold into anticlines and synclines. Swallets are essentially sinkholes, or if you were in Mesoamerica, cenotes. So water in the air absorbs carbon dioxide, which makes it slightly acidic. The acid in the rainwater reacts with calcium carbonated limestone, dissolves some of the rock. This reaction forms holes and pockets in the rock and makes it unstable. The instability is most likely to occur in the Mendips, at least, where there are faults and weaknesses within the limestone. These swallets tend to occur where the Avon group, lower limestone shales, these right here, meet the what's the next? Oh, the Carboniferous limestone. That's the mountain limestone here. So you kind of get this meet, and the water hits this, and this is a little bit stronger, and the water sinks down along this here, kind of like it's looking like it's doing over here. It sinks down, and you forms these kind of cave systems until it comes out as a spring at the edge over here, works its way through. Consequently, Reed's Cavern is more of what is known as a boulder-choked pot rather than a cave, having formed at the junction of the Limestone Shales Formation and Mountain Limestone Formation. Along this junction, a number of other swallets, as we were seeing, and depressions have been recorded. Consequently, the archaeological stratigraphy within Reed's is complicated by periods of roof collapse, downward movement of the boulders that form the floor of the main cavern, and both fluvial and colluvial deposition and erosion processes. The floor of the main chamber is made of large boulders that have built up some 50 meters in elevation above the stable bedrock at the base of the limestone rift. So that information becomes important later on. Understanding the geology is important. So Iron Age in Europe. Western Europe is dominated by two major Iron Age archaeologically distinct cultures, Hallstatt and Laten. Hallstatt from roughly 800 to 450 BC, and Laten from roughly 450 to 50 BC. Hallstatt arose in Central Europe with the rise of what are thought to be political and social elites, possibly in response to the demand from cultures around the Mediterranean for exotic trade goods. During the Hallstatt period, fortified settlements arose on the top of hills along Europe's major river systems, the birth of the Iron Age hill fort. Hallstatt influence diminished between 450 and 400 BC, and as power shifted, the Laten cultural phenomena grew to dominate a similar region. The map on the bottom right really shows that. Let's see. Much of this is based on some pretty antiquated theories about how populations interact, and recent genetic evidence has really rewritten much of what we thought about early European cultural groups. So this is just a general archaeological cultural group thing. This is kind of showing where dating and the material indicates some of these phenomena as kind of assemblages originated. Either way, it seems that population growth within the Laten groups was a catalyst for territorial expansion in what sometimes is referred to as the Celtic migrations, though how much migration is a whole bit of question. Laten groups are what the Romans knew and who became the Gauls that Julius Caesar documented. In England, the Iron Age begins and the Bronze Age ends around 800 BC, with the Iron Age ending with the Roman invasion in 43 AD. The Iron Age lasts longer in Scotland until the Viking period around 800 to 1000 AD. In Ireland, it lasts until the arrival of Christianity. I should Note that the Romans did make incursions into both Scotland and Ireland, but they have their own separate kind of histories of Iron Age that last a lot longer. Britain's Iron Age generally follows what's happening in mainland Europe, with lots of trade and interaction with continental groups, even though they aren't considered part of the Hallstatt core or influence per se, at least not this part of Britain. Hill forts began appearing in Britain right at the end of the Bronze Age and the start of the early Iron Age in England. During the early period, there's little evidence of settlement within hill forts. Instead, hill forts are more focused on trade and seasonal gatherings. After about 450 BC, the hill forts that don't go out of use become more complicated, and many have clear evidence of large permanent populations. However, during the Iron Age, most people lived in small settlements, possibly holding single extended families. The standard domestic building was a roundhouse, seen here. Where am I lose my place? Roundhouse. Roundhouses were typically made of timber or stone, thatch or turf, depending on the locally available material. Along marshes and lakes, substantial sediments have been documented, some on artificial islands. In Scotland, the artificial islands are known as crannogs. Also in Scotland, large stone towers known as brocks served as the basic village or family household. These structures were also sometimes surrounded by smaller roundhouses. This is a reconstruction of Old Oswerty Hill Fort, and this is a reconstruction of the Atrebates settlement in Silchester in the bottom left. And these are just kind of giving you kind of the groups and some stuff about the Iron Age there. Into what the Iron Age is like in southwest Britain. There are hill forts. This is Tollbury Camp, the one pretty close to Reeds. Nearby settlement includes the Mere and Glastonbury Lake villages. This is a reconstruction of them. They were constructed on the Somerset levels, which was basically a very swampy, marshy area that was drained in the early modern period to make farmland. But before that, it was basically marsh where you could take canoes and stuff out. It was a giant, giant marsh. And they built their settlements out of timber and clay on man-made islands at these villages sites. Just outside of what we typically consider the Southwest are what are known as black earth sites. In places such as the Vale of Pewsey, kind of over by Stonehenge, black earth sites are characterized by large midden-like deposits made up of humic material up to 2 meters thick, containing large amounts of pottery, animal bone, and sometimes including entire pots broken in situ. Also on the periphery of the region, but worth mentioning, are hoards containing metal artifacts and animal bones, often ritually deposited in lakes and rivers. Not a lot from this area. Iron Age in the Mendips. Not only do we have Burrington and Dullbury, but we also have Banwell, and way over on the coast we have Whorlbury. These are the kind of settlements in the area. This is the Romans eventually put this nice Roman road across the top. If you're talking about the major Roman road in the area was the Foss Way. It's just a little to the east of this here. The mining took place from starting in the Iron Age in the Mendips, but really took off during the Roman period. So you get quite a few mines in there. There's not a lot of other settlements activity on the Mendips, mainly because the limestone does not do well for cultivation, so you don't get a lot of water sticking around. It kind of sinks into the ground in these swellets instead of giving you a place to actually cultivate stuff. So there isn't a lot of evidence of villages and stuff other than the hill forts on the Mendips themselves. This is just kind of another map of the area showing some of the sites, the different ones. We have barrows and cairns, we have linear earthworks, and we have our enclosures, which are our iron hill forts and stuff that are showing up in here. That's just a brief bit. These are the sites of Iron Age cave use kind of in the region. The ones in blue have been excavated. So it's just one of only a number. Reeds is only one of a number of caves that were being used at this time, and some of them have been excavated. So Iron Age cave use in general. Broadly, caves are used for everything during the Iron Age somewhere in Britain. Caves have had some of the only evidence for Iron Age cannibalism. This mainly comes from the excavation at Alveston, north of the Mendips, and Goff's Cave in Cheddar Gorge. The potential for further evidence of Iron Age cannibalism excited some of the sponsors of our excavation because they were hoping that we'd find more evidence of it. Caves with more restricted access or more swallet-like Alveston, were more likely for the deposition of human remains in large quantities. Alveston was excavated on Time Team and documented by Wessex Archaeology, which is why we get these lovely reconstruction drawings of how they were depositing human remains in there. Domestic settlement activity in what is often cited in the literature is the most common Iron Age activity, at least in the literature. However, the evidence for this is rather suspicious. A lot of the caves would not have been particularly nice places to spend a significant amount of time. Caves with easier access and larger spaces seem to have a greater variety of activities. Common evidence includes evidence of smelting, slag and charcoal. Some of the earliest evidence of iron smelting in Britain comes from nearby Rowberry Cavern and Chelm's Combe. However, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, it should be noted Rowberry Cave has a similar black charcoal-rich layer to what we found at Reed's Cavern, and it may not be the iron smelting that they claimed it was when they excavated it about a century ago. All right, on to the discovery of Reed's Cavern. So the University of Bristol Speleological Society was founded in 1919. At the first meeting of the society, someone suggested that a cave might be expected at the Reed's Cavern location due to the local geology. There were a couple swallets kind of right up against this cliff face, and they said, yep, there's probably a cave there. So on September 13th that year, they removed 21 tons of material searching for an entrance to the cave system. Eventually, only a ton of material had actually needed to be removed to get to their eventual entrance. Some of that removal was done by dynamite. So they were blasting away at the side of this cave to try to get into a cave in there. Professor Edgar Kinsley Trapman was the first down the hole into the cavern. At the time, he was supported by Leo Palmer, who was an archaeologist at Bristol at the time. Trapman was a professor in the Department of Medicine for Dentistry. He was a dentist. Leo Palmer was eventually the primary excavator of the site. They were amazed by what they found once they got into the cave. In 1968, Trapman, and this is important for later on, noted that there was potential for intact deposits beneath the talus slope from where they originally entered the cave. Just for kind of a comparison's sake, I have this photo from their original excavations, and pretty much one of the first times they were in there, they took this photo. That's their original entrance is kind of up this way, which is why you get a little bit of light coming in. But this is what it looks like today, and that's the boulder that the person is sitting on. So you can kind of see a person sitting right here. That's the boulder they're sitting on right there. The cavern has changed quite a bit since then, though you can still pick out some of the major landmarks going on in there. All right. The cave was originally named the Celtic Cavern, and initially they mapped and collected only surface finds. And I will zoom into a detailed, surface finds. Quickly realized that the cave had significant archaeological deposits, and then spent 5 consecutive seasons of excavation from 1919 to 1924, and a 6th season of excavation in 1929 that focused on the area they thought was the entrance right in here. This was their entrance. This is where they thought the Iron Age entrance was, and they kind of dug through in this tunnel area that they thought collapsed on people and when it ended, partially because they found some human remains in there. Okay, now a little bit more detailed view of this. In here, you can see solid dots represent faunal remains that they found on the surface. The open dots, like this one here, were what they called hearths. And so you can see them kind of scattered around. And then the kind of bullseye looking ones, so you get one right in here and one right in here. That's where they found human remains, mostly on the surface or partially encased in flowstone. They did put in an actual trench, and I believe this is the only trench they did. Some of the reports kind of make it seem like they excavated like this the entire cave. I don't think they did. I think they really just surface collected everything off of the cave and didn't go below the flowstone anywhere. They just kind of pulled off anything that had kind of accumulated on top of the flowstone or stuff that was easily accessible out of the hearths, quote unquote hearths. I will make that clear. But this is their trench inside the cave, and they did this trench out here in 1929 to try and find this entrance and whatnot. Trapman indicated in that 1929 excavation that the entrance had been fitted with a door with a lock and key, and that steps may have been built to facilitate easier access to the cave. The tunnel has since collapsed since they excavated it, and we couldn't investigate it any further. So what did they find? They found a large assemblage of pottery fragments, possibly representing more than 100 vessels. They were able to reconstruct some of them. Not enough recording of the context of the pottery. Basically, you just saw the recording they have of the context, so that we could figure out if it had been in a scatter, if it had been just mixed up all over the place. Not much context information found. Glastonbury ware is Middle Iron Age, dating from 300 to 100. So this is all Glastonbury ware. It was all the same type of pottery that they found. They also found metal and stone artifacts. So they found brooches and sickles, and these are probably, they call these shackles, but they probably were horse hobbles. Found hoops for drinking vessels, they found tankard handles, they found Celtic rings, they found bracelets, they found all kinds of things, spindle whorls, lots of stuff. The assortment of metal artifacts really is what led them to conclude that it was habitation or industrial site, because there was just so many kind of standard everyday artifacts that were coming up for kind of a domestic site. Faunal remains. They found a lot of faunal remains, both unworked, both domesticated and wild species, and then they had worked boar tusk, deer antler, bird bone formed into toggles, cheek pieces, handles, needles, awls, and worked artifacts with unidentified purposes. So you kind of get an idea of what they were finding there. And they also found human remains. I'm going to show you the human remains, and then we'll move on. There were 13 fragments of human bone, possibly representing 4 individuals, including possibly 2 children. These were either found on the cave floor, covered in a layer of talus, or by the theorized prehistoric entrance, which had collapsed, and they thought that it had collapsed and killed people in it. One human fibula with potential cut marks was indicated. I think those cut marks are a bit dubious, and we'll get to that later on. They drew 2 conclusions from it. Most of the remains represented people who died in the collapse of the cave, or were people who were killed through cannibalism, or eaten at least. Those were their kind of 2 conclusions of it. So there it is. You can see this is what the flowstone looks like. You can see that it's partially encased in this flowstone. The flowstone developed around the bone, not necessarily over it. The bone, there was not probably very much flowstone when the bone was deposited in this location. And that's it. That's the only human remains I'm showing in it. Conclusions, they interpreted the site based on kind of the known site types from the time. Some of it a cemetery, some of it a habitation. They thought it might be a kind of refuge, a place to hide during, conflict. So the cave was quite well ventilated, or at least they thought it was quite well ventilated until the cliff over the entrance had collapsed killing some of the inhabitants and sealing the entrance. It is kind of a dubious thing because they're talking about there being a door to it and saying that it had lots of light. If they'd had an entrance fitted with a door, I'm not sure how you had it well lit. This was not. If you had just a door, it would be no better lit than it is today in there, and it is very, very poorly lit inside. So this is tells you something about how they were thinking about it and how they thought about people living at the time. So it was not particularly well lit. It was well ventilated. I'll give them that. It does have good ventilation through there. Okay, so here's part of the thing that we also need to understand. I couldn't go back and look at any of this material. During World War II, during the Blitz, Bristol was targeted, and the Bristol Museum, where all of the artifacts were being housed, was bombed and destroyed during the Blitz. A handful of artifacts, the artifact catalog, and the published excavation reports are all that really survived. The artifacts that did survive, most of which were artifacts that had been lent out to other places, like the metal artifacts, and some of them had survived but were very, very badly scorched. So there was very little analysis that could be done on them afterwards. So there might have been some artifacts still, but you couldn't do much with them. Most of it was completely destroyed. So you can't look at hardly anything from the original excavations to do some comparisons. So how did we get involved? Basically, the Wood Springs Museum, which is located just on the south side of the Mendips, is one of the few places that has some of the last metal artifacts from Reed's Cavern. And the curator in 2009, who happens to be a caver himself, likes going caving, he noticed a collapse in the main cavern. The collapse had opened up a crevice in the cave floor, exposing a black charcoal-rich layer. And this layer was being disturbed as cavers tried to open another navigable passage through the cave. So they were trying to find another passage to go through the boulder choke and work their way down to the bottom, which is, kind of crazy to do, having been through there a bunch, but it's cavers. Cavers are a unique brand of people. But how we got involved was really through our friend Ruth, who was a master's student at the time. She was also a caver, and she was doing archaeological science in her master's degree at that point. She was interested in it, was asked by the Speleological Society, who'd been contacted by the Wood Springs Museum, hey, do you know anybody in the archaeology department, or do you want to run an excavation here to kind of record this collapsing area in this area where we're getting some archaeology exposed? And she's like, I have one field school. I don't have the experience to do that, but I do know some other grad students. And she asked my wife and I, who was at the time my girlfriend, to if we'd be willing to do it. And I just spent a few seasons out on Stonehenge running excavations and helping out with that, and I'd spend a season the summer before up in Scotland doing a field school up there on Chambered Cairns. So I had been doing quite a few excavations at that point, and I'm like, yeah, I've been supervising enough of this. I'll run an excavation for you. Little did I know what I was getting into. We had a shoestring budget, and caves are very, very challenging to excavate. If you've never thought about it, they're hard. Lighting is a challenge. You cannot see once you're past the entrance of this cave. And to have light, you really need power. So, and just so you know, when they excavated originally in the 1920s, they excavated by candlelight. So just to kind of give you a perspective. You need power, and you need a generator that has the right capacity for lots of lighting, because lighting takes up a lot of electricity, and most generators cannot handle big bright lighting. So we had to get an extra large generator out there and keep it running with gas. Everybody also had to make sure they had lights on them at all times, because you never quite knew when the generator was going to run out of gas and the lights would just go out and you'd be stuck in the dark in the cave, which happened fairly frequently. And we'd all just stop and somebody would turn on the light and one of us would head out and go restart the generator. Funding is a challenge on these types of things. So this was a rescue excavation initially, but I managed to get a grant from the Speleological Society for some of the costs. I also got some funding from the University of Bristol Archaeology Department to do a field school. And at the time, I had just been elected president of the Bristol Archaeology and Anthropology Society, and I managed to convince them to give us a little bit of funding as well, and we ended up with a budget of about £1,200. So most of that budget went straight to lighting and generator and sump pump for the next thing, which is actually doing wet sieving, which you can see pictured down here, where you have to do wet screening. Cave earth, as it's called, is basically pure clay. It does not go through a screen at all. It is almost 100% clay. It really required wet screening on a lot of it. So we had a sump pump set up in a river with a hose pushing it down to the wet screen, which was basically set in the channel that the river uses through the cave as it makes its way through the cave. So dry screen just wasn't an option. And mapping in a cave is hard. You have no GPS in a cave. So we had to use some old school methods and tie in points after points as you go around curves to get down in there, so that we could actually kind of get where this was in real time space, because it doesn't really work very well these days. Now it'd be pretty easy because you can do it with laser scanning and photogrammetry in a way that we couldn't do 14 years ago when we did this, but it was a challenge. It was quite a challenge to try and get everything mapped in there. We mapped it pretty detailed. We did it at 50 centimeter mapping of the entire cave. This is what our map looks like. So you can see the 1919X entrance here. This is where the current entrance is. There's some passages going up this way from here. This is where our main excavation block was. This is a small excavation to see if there was anything left. This is where their excavation was. That's their boulder that they were sitting on. And we put in a little tiny excavation over here because there's a large talus slope kind of coming down from this entrance. They covered a bit of flowstone. We broke through the flowstone, and lo and behold, underneath that flowstone was thick black charcoal layer with a whole bunch of artifacts in it, in between two layers of flowstone. So it was a very, very useful little excavation and told us that there's a lot more archaeology over here. We had a few major goals in this. First, was to see if there was anything still there. We really wanted to get it mapped well, so we could see how the cave had changed and compare our work to the previous excavations. And we wanted to see if we could have a better understanding of what was going on in the cave, since none of the materials survived. So that's really kind of what we did. We did have a lot of safety concerns. We used rock climbing equipment to get into the cave, even though you don't absolutely have to have it. Everybody had caving helmets for the most part. We also used a bit of rock climbing rope to hold this boulder up over our excavations because we didn't really want something jarring it loose and it falling on people. It was always kind of dubious working in that area. We were not able to, even though we thought we were going to kind of cut that original trench a little bit at our corner here, we did not find any evidence of that original trench when we did our excavation. So this is kind of our excavations mapped onto that earlier map, so you can kind of see what we're looking at here. We did a pretty big trench in there, mapped using British standards, so no 1x1 units, but all done by lots or context as it is in the UK. So we were doing it in a lot of different layers in there. Also, it gets quite cold in caves. If you aren't used to that, it was about 12 degrees Celsius all the time. So wet sieving was kind of harsh on the students who had to wet sieve all the time because they were getting soaked in pretty chilly weather all the time. So here's the stratigraphy. So this is just kind of a section of our trench. We have all the boulders and stuff that's on top. That's that one that said J, and this is their number on it. This is the boulder the guy was sitting on. Here it is right here in the photo. And we have this kind of black, sludgy, charcoal-rich layer that kind of goes on and is mixed with kind of a pinkish red. Not that you can see it in our photos very well. Clay earth layer in there that gets mixed in, and there's boulders everywhere. So chunks of the limestone collapse from the ceiling and fall into the cave fairly regularly. So directly above the boulders is a red-brown clay, which corresponds to the previous excavation descriptions of clay earth. Small lenses of charcoal and faunal remains were found within thick segments of cave earth, which may represent earlier periods of use in the cave. Those small kind of deposits, discrete deposits of charcoal and faunal remains, were very deep and just need to be dated at this point. There were unsubstantiated reports that we got from people who'd been around for a while saying that flints had been recorded found during the 1920s excavation and handed off to somebody to analyze, but it never got analyzed. Don't know how that could happen. Nobody would ever have something like that happen where they passed off artifacts and it never got analyzed and put in a report. Above the dark sludge was flowstone sealing the deposits. Oh, the Iron Age stuff was in what was a rich dark sludge deposit, which corresponds to a thick layer of black mud described in previous excavations. Above the dark sludge was flowstone sealing most of the deposits. Remember, the initial excavations were done by candlelight. We think that they mistakenly thought that the places where they had hearths were areas where the flowstone had been damaged by roof collapse or where the flowstone hadn't covered, and so you were just getting flowstone openings in the flowstone where you had the dark earth, because the dark earth extends everywhere in the cave. There is not one distinct little like hearth. It is everywhere you get it. However, none of the material we recovered had any evidence of being exposed to heat or fire. So none of it, the animal remains that were in it mixed in with charcoal, none of it had any evidence of it. And the cave earth itself did not have any evidence of being burnt in situ either. So we had fires that have been lit since the excavations took place, and we could really tell where that had happened on top of cave earth, that it oxidized the earth really clearly, and you knew that there had been fire there. There was no evidence of any of that in the earlier Iron Age stuff, so it's pretty clear that most of that material was being brought in as a secondary deposit. Let's see. Within the better preserved sections that were completely sealed by flowstone, we encountered complete carbonized branches of wood. So close that we could almost get tree ring dating to work on some of them, because they were carbonized but really, really well preserved. It indicates that the deposit hadn't been washed in. These things were not washed in later. It would have destroyed a lot of this stuff. Above the flowstone was a light brown silty clay similar to the clay earth that appeared below the Iron Age deposits. And that seems to have accumulated since about 1919, as it did bury some candles. So one of the things we found in there was a lot of candles from the original excavations. There's been quite a bit of boulder collapse since 1919. A social event near our big trench, we believe it in the 80s or 90s, had a bunch of charcoal, and a roof collapse probably happened right after or during the event where it fell on top of their fire. There was a big boulder from the roof in the middle of a fire pit that had been made recently, very recent fire pit. So what did we find? Well, we found evidence of cavers and parties and the original excavations, batteries from old caving lights, and people having parties and stuff, candle stubs, stuff like that. Fun stuff. I can assure you, finding candle stubs is a unique thing to find as an archaeologist because it's really hard to figure out what the heck this thing is that you've just pulled out of the ground. You're not expecting a candle that's kind of half melted to. You can't tell what the heck it is. You know it's not natural, but what the hell is this thing? Took a little while before we figured out what the heck it was we found. But we also found pottery, the same pottery that was found by the original excavations, Glastonbury ware. We only got about 23 sherds. None were larger than 5 centimeters, but it did match what they had before, so confirmed a Middle Iron Age date for the Iron Age deposit for the most part. We found faunal remains. We found quite a bit of faunal remains, 128 faunal bones or fragments. Few of the faunal rib bones and toe bones were overrepresented. I don't know why toe bones were overrepresented. Rib bones is probably having to do with feasting, and a number of those rib bones showed evidence of butchery. A few of the faunal remains gave indications of past pathology. So we had one broken and healed rib bone, another set of ribs which we tested later for tuberculosis, had significantly decreased bone density. So this one here, I believe it's a pig rib, but it weighs less than most bird bones. Like, it has no density to it, so it's really fascinating. The faunal analysis has not been completed at this point, and none of the faunal remains had any evidence of burning. We also found some worked bone. So this is a boar's tusk toggle for clothing. So it's basically a button that you put through something on clothing, but it's carved out of boar's tusk, wild boar's tusk. So found some of that. Most exciting find, we found this beautiful brooch. This brooch is Latin 2 style. It comes from the continent. It's not typically found in Britain. We could not find anything close to it anywhere in England or Britain, anywhere else in Britain. It is very unique. It's also very unique because it still works. You can still use this pin and it will still clasp. It's still a functional bronze brooch. Normally brooches have the pin broken off or severely damaged, but this one is still in working order. It's pretty unique given its small size and its design. Most of the ones coming from Britain during the Iron Age are about twice this size. So this is a really, really tiny brooch that it was in very good shape. But it still also matches the Glastonbury ware ceramic states. So it all pretty consistent there. And we found some human remains, a single human tooth, which you don't actually need a license to, or an application here, this license to remove human remains for a single tooth. But when we found the single tooth, we didn't know that it was going to be a single tooth and that we weren't going to find anything else. So despite the desire of a particular professor to try and advance his pet theory of cannibalism, we didn't find much human remains. And that single human tooth, we ended up sending it off for scientific analysis, and it no longer exists at this point. It was destroyed during the scientific analysis of it. Okay, so on to our interpretations. So looking at that stratigraphy, we'll kind of work our way backwards, and I might flip back and forth between their map and this kind of timeline here. Our excavations took place in 2010. The collapse in that main floor that opened up that trench happened in 2009. Sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a large social event with a prominent fire, leaving deposit in the area of Trench 1. with roof collapse. In 1967, a new entrance opened. It's not near the prehistoric entrance, but it opened through natural erosion. That's how we were getting in and out of it. Between 1930 and 1967, there was explorations in the cave. Between 1919 and 1930, there was lots of excavations. Between around 50 AD and 1919, it appears that the entire cave chamber was sealed through natural processes, and part of how that's indicated is through the flowstone forming over deposits and forming in the cave. So one of the things we discovered is that when the main chamber is open, flowstone doesn't form. So there is no new flowstone forming in that main chamber at this point. If you go off to some of the side chambers that are away from where it's well ventilated and where it's open to the air, there's pretty minimal flowstone development right now, but in the main cave itself, when it's open, it does not develop flowstone. Instead, it develops cave earth. So you start getting that cave earth deposits going up. Those side chambers that we found that we looked in, going off away from where there's Iron Age activity, or at least as far as we could tell, no cave earth is being deposited. So you're not getting the cave earth deposits where you don't have it open to the elements to some extent. When it's not open, you don't get that. So we say it was completely sealed around 50 AD, mainly because there is one Roman coin that seems to have flowed in there. We think that the human remains got deposited in a swallet. So back to this one, we have a swallet here and a swallet here in their map. So this is what was there before they blasted an entrance here, or an entrance here really, into the cave. There was a swallet and a swallet here. This is where the new entrance is. It comes right through this way. The stream still goes that way. And this is the wet swallet. We actually think that this is probably where they were depositing the human remains. And at the time, it was completely sealed. The water wasn't actually going into the cave after about 50 AD, and it just was completely sealed up. But probably from, roughly 150 to 50, the only way to get into the cave was probably through this, by putting things into the swallet and letting it wash into the cave. So those human remains, we suspect, washed into the cave probably through the swallets that fed into the cave through different systems. Yeah, so I said 100 in here, but 100, 150, somewhere in that area. But between about 500 and 100, 150, something like that, the main chamber is accessible and the large charcoal-rich Iron Age deposit is created. Looks like it was probably, our preliminary interpretation is it was probably brought in separate batches that people were bringing in fairly regularly and depositing basically their hearth trash, midden charcoal stuff in there, very charcoal-rich stuff going in there. But before 500, based on the flowstone that we get underneath the Iron Age deposit in certain places, it looks like it was pretty sealed off. And that there wasn't much activity from probably about 4,000 onwards. We suspect that probably from about 8,000 to 4,000, it was wide open, and it was probably more a rock shelter than a cave at that point, based on kind of what we could get from the geology on that. It was generally accessible, and that's where the large red-brown clay earth underneath the Iron Age deposit and flowstone, to be fair, flowstone in large portions of it covering that cave earth formed, and you got, in places 50 to 75 centimeter thick cave earth deposits in there over boulders. We think that's probably how that kind of time period stuff happened. A lot of this is kind of questioned. We haven't gotten any dates back from any of the stuff that's in the cave earth. We haven't gotten anything to really date this clearly. We did take samples of the flowstone, which we know we can use uranium series dating on, to kind of put some brackets on some of the stuff and put brackets to when it was happening, because you can date the flowstone pretty accurately that way. but we haven't gotten. We had somebody come and take samples for it for part of their PhD to run, but they didn't end up using our samples as part of their research, so we didn't get them back. But we did collect some samples that could be used with it. So the big thing is really that timeline and our understanding of how this site kind of formed, that the human remains and the rest of it are probably pretty separate deposits at different times in different kind of circumstances. And then we did have a grad student who was out there with us who was working on strontium isotope analysis using laser ablation on teeth. So since we had a tooth, we sent it to him to run as an analysis. Strangely, well, he thought it was really boring results that he got out of it. He's like, oh man, that tooth was so boring. Because laser ablation, you can basically date each year of growth in the tooth. And so you can see where people moved across the landscape every year as their adult teeth are forming. And you can take bulk sample from parts of it to get kind of where they were living over the last kind of couple years of their life. Well, the results came back very, very, very decisive. The person whose tooth that was had never left the Mendips. They spent their entire life on the Mendips, had never gone more than about 2 or 3 miles from the cave. The geology is fairly varied in that area, and it gives you different strontium isotopes, but from the analysis, he's like, yeah, this guy drank water from really close to the cave, and that's it. He didn't go very far at all. He probably didn't leave more than a mile or live anywhere more than a mile or two from the Mendips. I thought that was fascinating. He was open to be able to show all the movement he did across the landscape and where he lived in different places growing up. But yeah, no, he grew up in one spot and didn't really leave. Place he died. So, but that also confirmed that tooth was almost certainly Iron Age. It would not work for someone to have lost that tooth caving, which was one of our concerns with the human tooth, was that it was something somebody had lost caving in the recent past. Preservation in the cave was so good that you really wouldn't have been able to tell the difference just from preservation. So on that side, it wasn't a recent one. We ended up throwing out a lot of the interpretations. Part of our thoughts when we were looking at it being deposited through the swallet and what would have happened to these bones going through there with the kind of jagged boulders that go in there. We think that the quote unquote cut marks on there are probably things that happened as part of the deposition as they went through the swallet into the cave itself as they worked their way through before their final deposition, and weren't actually butchery marks on the human remains. So we tossed out the cannibalism pretty much completely. There was not really good evidence for that at all. We wish we could go and examine the human remains to really confirm whether or not they were butchery marks or not, but all we have is their description from 1920s, and that's what we can go off of, is that there's pretty legitimate reason why it would have been marked up based on how our interpretation of how they probably got deposited in there, and just can't go back to look at them. Otherwise we would, but kind of toss that out. Looking at the charcoal rich layer. So this is one where we spend a lot of time kind of looking at theory and trying to understand these things. There's no evidence of in situ burning in there. The cave couldn't have supported any type of heat for industry and there's no slag in there, so that interpretation gets thrown out as well. It's the roof collapses with any source of heat. Like it's very clear that if you set a fire in that cave, the roof is going to collapse. The limestone is too friable; it just breaks and collapses right on top of you. It's not a good place to set a fire. And so we kind of lost that one, gets thrown out. And so in trying to understand it, that we were pretty puzzled by this deposit. I mean, it doesn't make much sense. We looked at the black earth sites out in Pusey. And it doesn't quite match. I mean, we're getting some of the same stuff, but those black earth sites mainly have pottery and faunal remains, which is what we found for the most part. We found faunal remains and pottery. That was the main things we found. So it seemed like it was a pretty good fit, except for the fact that you almost never get artifacts like bronze or iron or any of those kinds of artifacts like they got from the original excavations in black earth sites. They very rarely leave those types of things in black earth sites. So it didn't quite match either. It's pretty close. So I mean, for us, the distinguishing feature that kind of came out of it was that it was these were deposits that were probably intentionally made into the cave. And our thoughts move towards kind of more ritual understandings, so to speak. I hate to put it that way. And we looked at some of Durkheim's discussions about the sacred and profane. The importance of the study from Durkheim is rather than seeing the terms as a dichotomy directly opposed to each other, he noted that the two terms and concepts work in conjunction with each other. One does not exist without the other. Can't have something that's sacred if you don't have anything that's profane, and vice versa. Importantly, unlike much of the modern use of the words profane and sacred, the sociological use does not refer to the everyday when it says profane. That aspect, the everyday, is what's referred to as the mundane. So separating sacred, profane, mundane. Profane is something that is truly negative. So there's that third aspect in there. These are contextual terms, meaning that depending on the social context, an object could be one or the other, or all three of them. And so the social context is really kind of important to it. And so it's really hard to identify archaeologically, which is kind of the issue. But one of the things is that they tend to gain objects that are either sacred or profane, tend to have a lot of spiritual power, would be one way of trying to put it. And a lot of the things, best way to understand it is that actions are taken with these objects to either purify or contain their toxicity. That is what a lot of the rituals surrounding sacred and profane objects are about. When we break it down, it's either keeping them pure and uncontaminated or containing something that has been contaminated from being contaminated. And we can think of a lot of things, even in modern stuff, that are symbols and objects that we do that way, which is why I threw a modern landfill in there when we're talking about stuff. We look at middens and special middening activities. I would say that our ideas of middening and the sacred and profane still match pretty well. Our method of dealing with rubbish, burying it kind of matches pretty well. We do it over concerns of health, safety, cleanliness, toxicity. We rarely discuss landfills in terms of isolating and negating the profane toxicity of these objects that we put in there. It's a way to understand kind of what we do when we deal with our trash. Our method is for dealing with the material with the degrees of toxicity. One of the best examples that you can think of is nuclear waste. It's really powerful. We kind of go through complex, almost rituals to deal with containing nuclear waste and negating its polluting effect on society. They're deposited in caves. Not, I'm thinking there might be something going on here. This is the most powerfully toxic or potentially toxic material around at the time. I would say that that's probably what's going on at Reed's. These items, through their life history, through what's going on, are probably some of the items that had a lot of social power in some fashion. And you only understand that power by understanding its individual artifact history. Charcoal and fire and all these things are typically part of purification rituals, putting things in flowing water. All these things are part of kind of standard ways of dealing with these things. So it's not a huge stretch to necessarily think of it in that way. I'm not sure it really tells us much about the Iron Age, but it kind of tells you that people were human, but it is a way of trying to think about this and making it not seem just so strange and odd. So that is kind of where we looked at that. So the defining characteristic is it's a cave environment. And it can't be understood as a place of settlement, refuge, or production. What it really did is it had a role in changing cosmology in the Iron Age in Britain. You can think of it as out of sight, out of mind, but protected and safe. Objects deposited in the cave were not just local, but also from far away, not just domestic, but also agricultural. They had everything. Everything got put in there in some way. So where does the excavation stand today? The artifacts are processed, cataloged, and are being stored at the University of Bristol Speleological Society Museum. They have a new museum after the one that was destroyed in the Blitz. My wife, Allison, did all of the museum cataloging work with students. There are quite a few avenues of research still open on this site. Faunal analysis has not been done. We took some fairly large block samples that were sealed with flowstone on either side that could be micro-excavated from Trench 1 and from Test Trench E. You could also do some further landscape studies and do some comparisons with some of the other Iron Age sites surrounding Reeds. And everything is with the University of Bristol Speleological Society at this point. Our friend Ruth, who had started this, was originally going to do this as a PhD, but her funding fell through, so she didn't end up doing it as her PhD. After that happened, I went, I wish I was doing my PhD on this, because this would have been a great project to do my PhD on, instead of what I ended up doing it on, but that's neither here nor there. It is what it is. But I want to end there. Many thanks to many of the people. Reed's Cavern is on the Wills family estate, or partially on the Wills family estate, and they allowed us access to the property and gave us permission to do the excavations, even though it's kind of a weird on the border thing between National Trust land and the Wills family. The Speleological Society, the Archaeology and Anthropology Society, a whole bunch of people who helped us out during it. Dr. Andrew Chamberlain and Ann Tether came down to visit the cave for a day. I knew Ann from working at the Stonehenge Riverside project, and she and Andrew did all of our initial artifact analysis for us, and like separated out all our faunal remains and gave us a basic analysis of it, just as a chance to go through it all and ID it all and check it. Andrew Chamberlain's a bioarchaeologist and went through it all, and was our find specialist out on Stonehenge Riverside project. So they were great. They helped out a whole bunch. We also had Adam Stanford came out and took some amazing photos for us. He's a professional archaeological photographer. He does all kinds of really cool photos for different projects. I think he's been out to every project I've ever worked on out in the UK at some point to do professional photography of it, usually drones. And it was Skycam. He had it initially before drones were available, where he had this giant telescoping pole that he had on the back of his Land Rover that could take basically aerial shots of excavations from about 50 feet up. It was really quite nice and handy, but he got everywhere with his Land Rover and got some great photos. But it was a new experience for him to come and try and take photos in a cave, and he had a blast and came and helped out for a bit, and I wanted to thank him in there as well. And to all of our student diggers who did it as a field school, many are still doing archaeology. One of the students who dug out there is now the historic environment officer for Somerset. So in the area that holds this, the historic environment record, basically they're the county archaeologists for the area where Reed's Cavern is now. They were one of our students out on that dig. So it's pretty nice to see them moving on. Anyways, thank you everybody for bearing with me while we go through this, and